Welcome to Rebel Health Radio, bringing the best in alternative and integrative medicine to your ears. Hello everyone, it's Patricia Warby from Alchemy Therapies, and it's time for a weekly update. And today I wanted to do a little bit of a book review and also make some notes on some of the clients I'm seeing and some general themes around mind-body conditions. Now, the first thing I wanted to talk about really is the book, The Divided Mind by John Sarno, MD. Now, this is a relatively older book. It's 2006, but it is one of his most recent. John Sarno was a doctor who specialized in mind-body conditions before mind-body was even a thing. And he certainly was in the vanguard. He wrote a very small book called Healing Back Pain many, many years ago, I think in the early 90s. But it was very different to most of the books that were out there on the subject. Most people considered if you had back pain, then the problem was in the back. And indeed, MRI, scans such as MRI, would show disc deviations, and everybody assumed that was the reason for the pain. But Dr. Sarno disagreed. He started to see patterns that maybe other physicians were missing because he considered the psychology of the person in front of him. And so his idea was that it was repressed emotions sort of unconsciously driving autonomic responses in the body, which created pain or fatigue or sometimes strange neurological symptoms like numbness or tingling, dry eyes, difficulty swallowing, tinnitus, irritable bowel syndrome. He believed most of these conditions were psychosomatic in origin. Now, unfortunately, the term psychosomatic, although completely accurate, has come to mean something completely different, which is, oh, it's all in your head, you've made it up, it's not real, and you're psychologically damaged. Now, that's not the true meaning. Psycho, meaning relating to the psyche or mind, and somatic, relating to the body, in one linked word is exactly what it is. It's the combination. And so mind-body was a preferred term in the end, because that seemed to fit what he was trying to say without the connotations that the patient themselves was to. And in any case, I think the idea of the divided mind is a really good topic for today, because we are so unaware, most of us, of what goes on under conscious awareness. And in fact, most of our processing is unconscious. Now, I've talked about in previous talks, I've talked about the conscious brain and the two halves, the left and the right hemisphere, and how they differ, and how indeed the right hemisphere has more connection to the unconscious parts of our brain. But it's probably time to delve deeper into this and notice that there is a very large component of your processing that goes on outside of your conscious awareness, and that includes pain and emotional processing, which are very, very highly linked in the brain, in certain areas of the brain, like the limbic brain, the anterior cingulate cortex. They have horrible names, these different regions, usually related to where they are in the brain. So anterior, more towards the front, the prefrontal cortex, which is just behind the eyes, and there are other regions like the insula, the thalamus, where all the input comes in, and areas of memory and stress response, the hippocampus and amygdala as well. And so these areas are very significant in terms of pain generation. And let me explain why. So most people have a huge degree of unconscious emotion present in them, usually from childhood experience, but it might have also been adult experience that triggered childhood rage. And I use the word rage really importantly here, not just anger or disgruntlement or some other more soft word. Rage is where you're needs are not being met in any moment. And young children have a huge amount of rage because their needs are very volatile and extreme. And if a parent, for whatever reason, isn't able to consistently meet those needs, the child will feel that, but they may not allow themselves to feel that in later life, because there's also the overlay of the personality, and the personality may tell you that it's simply unacceptable to be anything other than good, compliant, and perfectionist. And that's the other end of the traits that I see with clients with chronic conditions like this, what John Sarno calls TMS, or tension myoneural syndrome. That term didn't quite catch on. Most people you don't hear about TMS anymore. But if you think of mind-body syndrome or mind-body disorder, that's probably a catch-all term for what he's saying. And that includes things like chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, chronic anxiety states, just about anything that doesn't have a physical, obvious cause, that isn't an acute problem, but has been persisting over a number of months and years. So this unconscious rage is present in all of us, but it's masked and repressed, actively repressed by your conscious mind as being unacceptable, because you grew up maybe believing that you had to be good, you had to be responsible, you had to be the good boy or girl who did what they were told. And we're not talking here necessarily about difficult families. We're talking about the average family where you had reasonably loving, attentive parents. So you don't have to have trauma in the classic sense to have this unconscious rage. It's almost a normal part of growing up. But the personality tendencies to repress that are very much learned. Now, I grew up, as you probably already know if you've subscribed to my channel, having to be really good and responsible because I had a chronically ill father. And so I couldn't be rebellious or difficult, and just had to kind of keep things going for my mother, who was extremely stressed about that. And my brother was much more volatile, so I was the good one. Now, this wasn't a conscious decision on my part. I don't think I ever thought, all right, I've got to be a good girl. I just kind of learned it as I grew up, that things were tricky and difficult and unreliable in some ways. We wouldn't always know how he was going to be at any one time. And so I just had to buckle under, really, and get good grades at school, and never express my needs too much because that would overwhelm the family. And that is a classic pattern. Now, you don't have to have a parent who was ill like me. You only have to have some push, if you like, some drive to need to express your goodness, because that's the acceptable emotion. And any anger or disagreement or rebellion is actively suppressed. And it could also be, there's a vast array of different emotions that can be, but rage is the most common one. And it's certainly the one I see linked most to chronic pain and sometimes fatigue as well. But there could be grief, there could be fear, guilt is another big one. Guilt is huge. You did something you shouldn't have done, or you didn't do something you should have done, and you hold yourself to ransom unconsciously for your life unless you address it. These are all unacceptable to you consciously. You want to repress, you want to push them down because they don't feel like something that you are willing to embrace in yourself. You have this rose-tinted view of yourself that you are fine and there's nothing wrong, and you're going to be reasonably functional, but you do have these perhaps people-pleasing and perfectionist tendencies. If that sounds like you could be one of the people that, you know, is more prone to these mind-body conditions. You also have perhaps a need for control in your life, all right? You like to control your environment. Now, that doesn't mean you're a classic narcissist necessarily, although you may have slightly narcissistic tendencies. I do. I do like to have things in my environment under control, but sometimes that's completely shattered. It's been shattered this week because I've actually I've damaged my shoulder, and been very challenged this week, I must admit, because I've actually damaged my shoulder. I think you can see it's slightly lower for some reason. I've had a fall, which was very unexpected, but when I looked it up metaphysically, because there's a wonderful book called Metaphysical Anatomy, which I looked up left shoulder and accidents, and it seems I'm taking on too much responsibility for people, usually clients in my case, which did kind of mirror the pattern that's been happening recently. So there's nothing surprising in the world. There are no real coincidences. There's always a hidden meaning, perhaps. But in any case, it's really taken away a sense of control, because I can't do much. I've been in a lot of physical pain. I am gradually getting movement back, but it's very swollen and just very uncomfortable most of the time, and sleep is affected and so on. Now, I have a really good reason for why that's happening, so I can explain that to myself. But if I get a chronic condition, which I've had chronic fatigue syndrome, and nobody can explain it. Can you imagine how that feels for a person who likes to be in control of their life and likes to have all their ducks in a row and things going on, yet has this huge wellspring under the surface of unconscious rage, which may sometimes want to come out in the world if perhaps you've been drinking, or someone really upsets you, and you tipped over the edge into anger. But we all have these tendencies, I suppose, to minimize what's going on underneath, because we want to maintain semblance of control. So you may have that, like I do. You may find in life that something comes along that knocks you off your trajectory that you've carefully controlled all your life. It could be a divorce, it could be financial difficulties, it could be loss of a job. All sorts of things can happen, and it kind of unravels this carefully constructed idea of yourself as completely functional and perfect. All right. So now some of this is obviously past experience that's sitting in the mind body that hasn't been metabolized, hasn't been dealt with. As I said, childhood stuff. Some of it is present experience that you're not able to deal with because it's too unacceptable to you, it's too uncomfortable. But whatever those things are, they do accumulate in the mind body. So there's kind of like an accumulation of repressed emotion, which will eventually, like the steam from a boiling pot, it will kind of briefly come into conscious awareness as symptoms. Now, Sarno called that the symptom imperative, the idea that symptoms are here to speak what the mind cannot, if you like. They speak for you. And he conceived that, in fact, physical symptoms were almost a distraction from what was going on underneath, and they were something that you would pay attention to so that you didn't have to face what you were actually feeling. And I think he's got a very good point there. It's sort of like a dissociated feeling of, you can't feel emotion, so you dissociate it into pain or other symptoms. And I think just to say that he covers this in quite a lot of detail about the different characteristics. This book is written with 4 or 5 other people. It doesn't say that on the cover, interestingly, but looking in the introduction and contents, you see that many of the chapters have been written by people who I guess are MDs. They're all MDs who've taken on the idea of mind-body medicine and are using it to explain things like hypertension, rheumatology, so things like fibromyalgia, which tend to come under rheumatology, structural pain, and just generally family doctor sort of symptom based consultations. So whatever family doctors get, a lot of it can be put down to this mind-body condition, but it's never considered that way. And modern medicine has gone down the biomedical route, which is we will scan, we will test, we will see where you are, and then we will appropriately treat the symptoms, but it doesn't really treat the root cause, because we treat people as if they're simply bodies malfunctioning and not this complex interwoven psychology and the somatic. So it was and is a very groundbreaking book. I would say probably the Mind-Body Prescription, which he wrote slightly before this, is a better purchase if you want to start with Sarno's work. But there are other alternatives in this field now. There's Unlearn Your Pain by Howard Schubiner, which I think is possibly the most comprehensive. Oh, and I like this one, which is The Hidden Psychology of Pain, and that's by Dr. James Alexander. That is a brilliant book. So I should say there's also chapter 7 in my book, The Scar That Won't Heal, which covers a very succinct description of why pain accumulates, how it amplifies, because, as I said, the brain then has to interpret the signals it's getting from the autonomic nervous system, and may well start to take the view that everything that it receives is a threat. And so your stress levels and your threat levels go up and up and up, and what you're perceiving is that there's some danger in your environment, and the symptoms are the cipher for something you need to address. So it is really a groundbreaking new way of looking at chronic conditions. And it's been around, I guess, for, where are we now, nearly 20 years, but it takes that long to filter down into the practice of medicine. So we're really only now beginning to see mainstream medicine apply some of these principles, that a lot of symptoms are created by the brain. They're real, they're very painful, but they are created by the brain as a way of diverting attention from what's going on underneath. Now, the question I guess everyone's going to then ask me is, how do you treat these? Well, you have to, first of all, accept the premise that your brain has created the symptoms in order to distract you. Now, some people really struggle with that because they can't conceive of how a physical pain could be created in the brain, but you need to understand the way pain neurons work, and well, how pain is transmitted to the brain and how it's interpreted. But once you understand that, you can kind of see that pain itself is not it's not a distinct signal. It's created in the brain as a symptom. It could be anything that becomes painful. Therefore, touch can become painful for people with severe fibromyalgia, for instance. So once you accept that premise that your brain interprets what it receives and can get stuck in this high stress, high threat state where everything it perceives quickly gets interpreted as pain, then the intervention really, some people get intervention just by understanding that, and then suddenly their symptoms disappear. But by far the majority have to deal with the underlying emotions. So if it's rage or responsibility, or a feeling of deep sadness or guilt, these are times when you need to actually work that through, preferably with someone, but you can do it via journaling, sometimes through meditation, sometimes through having body work and having somebody really attend to you. But by far the majority benefit from some form of psychosomatic intervention, where you are able to connect with, not necessarily, you're not going to feel rageful, but just to understand that there is a sense of something underneath that isn't being heard. It's not like you're going to go out and beat someone up. Just to understand that there's a part of you that was never really tuned into. And that in itself can be totally liberating. So, folks, if that sounds interesting to you, I would say, investigate the books I've mentioned, and maybe watch some of Howard Schubiner's talks. I did reference that last week when he talked to Dr. Rangan Chatterjee on Dr. Chatterjee's podcast. So that's a very good summary of mind-body pain. And so if you want to come and heal yours, you contact me on alchemytherapies.co.uk, and I'll speak to you soon. Take care, everyone. Bye for now. Hey, hope you enjoyed listening to Rebel Health Radio. Do subscribe and look forward to catching you soon.